Death and rituals. Humans place great meaning on the way our remains are treated. And some people get into this more than others, but in general, across our species, we seem to be very concerned about what happens to our remains, what we think conceptually happens to people after they die. There's all kinds of ideas about that, from nothing up to individual souls go on forever, or all kinds of reincarnation stuff. So, but people also get very interested in what happens to the bodies and what you do with them after people die. We treat them in a ritualized way. We use ceremonies or social events in order to mark that there has been a transition. Maybe it's a transition from like birth, transition like some form of circumcision or baptism or something like that. In this case, we're talking about a transition from being alive to not being alive. And how do you handle that? And what do you do in order to make sure that the universe is back in order? We talk about your relationships with others and your relationship with the universe. Well, when somebody ceases to be, what do you do to mark that and to reestablish social relationships when somebody that was with us is now gone? Now, your textbook asks a very important and perhaps unanswerable question, because we can't go back and ask people, when did humans first comprehend death? However, we can turn to the elephants for an answer. We can't ask them, unfortunately, or we could ask them, but they won't answer. But they seem to gather around and get sad. And that might even go on for a while. We don't know exactly when humans first comprehended death, but elephants and some of the other, they seem to have something of an understanding of what is going on here. We can turn to the archaeological evidence. That is to say, now this won't tell us what people were thinking, but it will tell us when we found remains. By the way, it won't also tell us exactly when the first people started, for example, burying their dead, because we may not have discovered that archaeologically yet, but gives us a sense of what was going on. Once again, as we did with health, we see some evidence that Neanderthals had some burials of their dead. This is still debated because it's very difficult to say whether a burial is deliberate or not. For example, the Homo naledi finds in South Africa, some people say that Homo naledi was the reason those finds are so well preserved is because those small brain hominins were deliberately burying their dead. But that is it's very difficult to prove whether that happened or not, because it would be nice to find people adorned or ritually laid out in a certain way. When it comes to humans and when it comes to the archaeological identification of people who got deliberately buried, and they were buried in such a way that there were some practices that were done on a corpse or on a skeleton that indicate that they're in some sort of funeral rite and deliberately buried. We see evidence for this around 30,000 years ago, and with humans, it's clearly intentional. In fact, some of these cases are kind of funny because they seem to be, it's not that people were burying everybody. In these cases, and your textbook doesn't really go into this, some of these early burials were of people who you might be considered anomalous individuals who would have looked very unusual in their life. Some of them had congenital dwarfism, so they were very small. Some of them were very large. Some of them seemed to have some sort of obvious physical deformity. Who knows why they did it, but For human beings, it becomes obvious that people start to have these ideas that when you die, it is not the very end of you, that you're somehow preparing for something else. These corpses are prepared in such a way, they are oriented, perhaps buried in a certain direction, decorated with things that they might have used during life. Sometimes shells and other objects are intermingled with the bones themselves. Now, in terms of more general burials, we see cemeteries emerge archaeologically at about 15,000 years ago. Again, I'm not saying that these are the earliest cemeteries. Maybe we'll find earlier ones, but it seems to be the idea that there's a special place where you're going to bury many people, or most of your people, or at least a decent percentage of them, comes in at about 15,000 years ago. As we've seen with other things, this is again around the same time that we see settled life and agriculture start to emerge. So people become less nomadic in certain places. It may not be a complete surprise that this is around the same time that we archaeologically see cemeteries come into the picture. Of course, a lot of people may have been doing different things with bodies that do not involve cemeteries, like the famous Hindu cremation ceremonies at the Ganges. You're not going to find this archaeologically speaking. It could have been going on for thousands of years before that. The remains are in some ways treated ritually, but they are going along. They're being cremated, or peoples who deliberately left remains out so that they would be eaten by vultures. You're not going to archaeologically find that, but that is also something that was deliberately done and was part of a life cycle ritual. These are things that what anthropologists call rites of passage. A rite of passage means that you're having some ritual or a ceremony or an event which is marking this as a life stage. So you are passing from one stage of life to another. And people mark these things ceremonially. So birth, puberty, and death are all biological things that happen to people, but we also mark them ritually. Marriage is not something that happens to you biologically. That is a social thing that people decide to do or decide that you must do. That also is often surrounded by a rite of passage, which signifies that someone is going from one social state to another. Let me think of another couple rites of passage that occur among boys to men or girls to women. Let's see, the bar mitzvah, the quinceañera for Latin influenced cultures, a celebration, a first communion. All these things can indicate that someone is passing from one life stage into another. Anthropology has documented that in many of these rites of passage, they are marked by three stages. And your text doesn't talk about this, but I want to elaborate on it a little bit just because it's so interesting to think about and to think about how it applies to the kinds of ceremonies and rituals you might have already been to in your life and might go through. Now, this doesn't mean these things happen equally in all places, but it's a general outline of what tends to happen in these rites of passage. So you enter the rite of passage and you are one kind of person. Let's do marriage. You enter, you get engaged, you're still single, and then there is a period of separation. Traditionally, the bride goes off and puts on some special clothes, and the groom is not supposed to see the bride for a while. Gets separated off. Meanwhile, the groom goes off and they do their own things. They're separated off. And then we enter a period of betwixt and between, which anthropologists call liminality, the idea that you are at the limit or the threshold of something. You're neither in nor out of that state. In this time of liminality, things can get a little wild. You're having a big party. People are throwing rice at you. People are eating different kinds of cake. Bridesmaids are all hanging around the place. Groomsmen, people are dressed up funny. World's gone crazy. And then after that's all done, you wake up in the morning or you come out of the church. Maybe you don't have the party, but the person says, I pronounce you husband and wife, or I pronounce you a married couple. And you enter a new stage of your life, which is state two, which is now you are married. We have these three phases. You separate out, you do some special things during this period of liminality, and then you reincorporate yourselves into the world. Sometimes people are really separating themselves, the destination wedding, and going off where nobody can see you, and then you can really enjoy some liminality. We can see this also, some of you who's graduating is going to separate off in a bit, and they're going to put on some funny robes. They're going to take pictures in these robes and hats. And then there's going to be this time of liminality when they're going to have big graduation parties. And then they're going to be incorporated into life as graduates. You're going to expect them to be productive members of society. So there are various ceremonies that you go through. Some people would say that all of college is a time of liminality when the usual rules don't apply. And you can be out in the street playing football because nobody cares, because you're in a liminal period of your life. So for 4 years or 5 years, you get to be in this liminal period where nothing counts or the usual rules don't apply. And you don't get money, you get grades. And then you reincorporate as a real adult person who doesn't get to play football in the streets anymore. You have to get a job. So, humans, we think the elephants grieve, but we can really tell that humans grieve because we can ask them about it and they express it in various ways. So, humans openly grieve the loss of those they love. This seems to be a human universal. That is, all the societies we've been to, people do something which indicates that they are sad about someone that has died, the loss of those they love. And wherever you go, people are going to be sad. That doesn't mean they're going to be the same sad, but they have rituals. These rites of passage. A funeral also helps people manage this loss. Oftentimes at some sort of funeral ceremony, there will be that time of liminality when, yes, you're all dressed up and then they're serving food. In some cases, they're serving drinks. And it's like this time in which you're trying to manage this loss of a person. Your textbook describes laments. In some societies, people were told to cry very much. And some people get very serious about this. Some groups really emphasize their grief. I don't think these people do this anymore, but in this case, someone has cut off or had their own fingers cut off to indicate that they are grieving a loved one. Sometimes in certain very Catholic countries, the people wear black for a year after one of their close relatives dies, especially women. It seems to be something we impose upon the women to do often. Other people, other groups are subdued. There are societies in which you are encouraged to move past these losses with minimal lamenting. So it's not that people don't feel sad, but there are some societies in which their rites of passage are supposed to encourage you to not think about this so much and to move on with your life. So we can say that there's a law or a pattern. It seems to be a universal that humans do grieve the people that they love, but whether that means some sort physical alteration or loud crying or a minimal ceremony is a cultural thing. In the next part of the chapter, and there's some other fun things that will happen as we go along, it talks about ways in which people maintain connections with the dead. So, certain festivals and routines in which people emphasize that although someone special has departed, that doesn't mean they are gone from your life entirely. There are ways in which people try to keep these connections up.